Chapter 3 Poison in the Air 2,793 days, but who bothers keeping count? Shi Yang's mouth tasted like death. Stale blood and grit and phlegm and bile and probably other interesting bodily fluids leaked out internally from bits that weren't supposed to be poked holes in. Also, regrettably, the aftertaste of Wei Quanbai's congee, which had been horrible enough to almost make him break cover on the spot. Turned out, there were limitations to Yiling Lao Tzu's brilliance after all. It did clearly not extend to cooking. There was also a lot of pain, of course, but that was hardly new. Worse than the usual fare, granted. There had really been quite a lot of holes poked, but physical pain was just something he'd gotten used to turning out since he was little, and that left either focusing on the vile taste in his mouth or the horrible throbbing phantom weight of his lost sword arm, and he had no interest in thinking at all about the latter. Xiao Xingjin was resting, so still now that he had to keep watching his chest to make sure it was still rising and falling, unconsciously letting his own breathing fall in tune. If he hadn't been resting in the lap of Song Lan, it would have been a scene of perfection, but with a strap of dark clothing it was reasonably easy to tune the fierce corpse out, reduce him to scenery. Honestly, he was graciously willing to overlook quite a lot at the moment, because Xiao Xingjin was breathing, whole, alive, and finally looking at peace after being so distraught all evening. White and pure, the moon come down to rest lightly upon the ground. "You should help him change the bandages," he said absently. His eyes itch when the blood dries. Song Lan shot him a look of purest, darkest loathing, and made no move to answer. It didn't particularly matter. Song Lan didn't particularly matter. Watching Xiao Xingjin breathe, he felt strangely at peace too, the limp utter exhaustion after the frenzy of an obsessive goal reached, bloodied vengeance wrecked, sexual climax peaked, wrenching the one worthwhile being in the world out of the jaws of death. Sure, the blood loss might have something to do with it too. And at peace sounded far prettier than empty. Morning broke with gusts of wind and sullen clouds, storm brewing, and peace was the furthest thing from his mind. He hadn't slept. Whenever his eyes had started sliding shut from exhaustion, he had instantly started awake, either from stabs of pain or, admittedly more often, the absolute imperative need to make sure Xiao Xingjin was really there, still breathing. He glared blearily at Song Lan, who at least had the good graces to look equally grouchy after a cold, sleepless night, as though anyone had the right to look so disgruntled while holding Xiao Xingjin in their arms. The way they were curled up with each other was really starting to grate on his nerves. The wind howled, as frustrated as he, making the paper decorations flutter restlessly, and his eyes stung with the dust. A horrible thought hit home far too late. "We should get him inside," he managed around the stickiness of his mouth, rising urgency twisting already sore insides. "There's still poison in the dust from yesterday, and the wind is whipping it up again." Song Lan merely narrowed his eyes at him, clearly not inclined to move. "Are you stupid as well as mute?" he hissed. "The poison turns the living into walking corpses. You should know that better than most, Song Daozhang. Look at him. How much closer to death do you think he can be pushed before it reclaims him?" Still, Song Lan wouldn't move, and he suddenly had the most vivid mental image of the poison dust settling thick over the courtyard while they waited for the idiot to make up his mind, leaving them all mindless puppets, sitting around staring blankly at each other for eternity. What beautiful, beautiful irony. Hilarious. Song Lan finally moved, but only to lift Fu Xue from where it had rested already at his fingertips all night. "He doesn't want to go inside," he traced into the gravel, and Xu Yang stared at him in disbelief. "He doesn't want— That is not his choice to make," he snapped. "Do you think I spent the last 3,793 few years grafting the ritual to bring him back, only to have him die again right at our own doorstep? What I want is not for you to decide," Xiao Xingjin said, and sat up awake now apparently, rigid and cold. "You don't get to make choices for me anymore." He bared his teeth in frustration. It seemed yesterday's theme of unbelievable bad timing was still going strong. "Daojang," he gently but firmly insisted, "there's poison in the air. If we don't go inside—" "It's all come down," Xiaoxingzhen said. "It's not safe." And then he laughed, a rather unsettling little laugh, and he could guess at the joke, but it wasn't really funny. "If we stay out here, we all die. Is that better?" It was supposed to be a trump card, but the look on Xiaoxingzhen's face made something cold yank hard at his guts, because it seemed the answer wasn't a clear-cut no. There was a ringing in his ears, like the sound of shuanghua falling to the ground from lifeless fingers, over, and he tried to swallow, but his mouth was too dry. "We'll leave, then," he managed. "Leave the city, leave this place. It's better outside." Song Lan looked enraged, Fushe slamming the words, "We're not going anywhere with you," into the dirt, and he lunged forward with his bonds, snapping his teeth. "Would you rather he stayed here and died? Again? Is that what you want?" "Stop talking over my head," Xiaoxingzhen yelled, standing, and blissfully he seemed angry rather than the hollow surrender from just before. He always had been beautiful angry, though things had admittedly been easier with the anger directed somewhere other than him. Song Lan quickly stood as well, having the decency to look ashamed, raised his hand as though to take Xiaoxingzhen's, but then letting it fall morosely to his side again. For a brief moment their eyes met over the white-clad shoulder, and despite everything there was a heartbeat of mutual agreement before they looked away again, at Xiaoxingzhen, who was still breathing harshly, hands balled into fists. "You can tie me to a tree instead," he offered lightly, "and we can keep going where we left off, just with far more pleasant scenery. It's early morning, the birds will be singing. Haven't you missed that?" Xiaoxingzhen turned, and for a moment he thought the man might actually draw shuanghua on him, but then the anger seemed to drain and he looked exhausted again. This time Song Lan, slow and simple oxen that he may be, he wasn't entirely stupid, actually found the guts to lightly touch Xingzhen's hands, asking permission to speak. He couldn't make out what he signed, and it itched him, having to watch the intimacy of that one finger so tenderly, unhurriedly stroking at the delicate, upturned palm. Left out, left to wait for a reaction, an answer, to guess at the question. Finally, Xiaoxingzhen sighed and nodded. Song Lan held onto his hand far longer than seemed absolutely necessary, then let go and turned to stare at him with a cold, empty expression, picking Fushe up again. "Ah, curious," he thought as the man approached. Just what did that not mean? Agreement to leave? Or to let you have my head already? The blade, and it was becoming very familiar, having swept so often past his face lately, soon he'd be able to tell it by touch alone. Cut the ropes and he crumpled into a surprisingly boneless heap, 10 different kinds of pain waging a short, nasty war throughout his bled-out body before he managed to haul himself reasonably upright again. That answered that, then, head still attached, at least a little while longer. The way his lungs and right shoulder screamed as Song Lan grabbed his collar and dragged him roughly to his feet made him briefly wonder whether that was a good thing. He managed not to drown himself in the stream, though more through happenstance than any particular skill on his own part. Song Lan had apparently decided a ridiculous amount of ropes was still necessary, his remaining arm firmly thrust behind his back, which was flattering if very much overrating his current abilities. He felt as unsteady on his feet as Xiaoxingzhen looked, and once they had left the looming threat of the deserted city behind, he could start relaxing. He allowed himself a laugh at the absurdity. 3 half-cripples traipsing down the road. Reaching the stream outside the city walls, they stopped to drink, and between the ropes and the fact that not one of the good Dao Shi seemed willing to lend him a hand, he had to kneel at the rocky shore and plunge his face into the water like a mangy dog. Finally able to wash the worst filth out of his mouth and gulp down water like something dying of thirst, which was probably what he was. It took some time, but once refreshed, he managed to settle back on his heels without toppling face first into the water, fixing his gaze back on Xiao Xingjin. He sat resting on a larger stone with his white robes draped over the rocks around him, very nearly glowing, as though it was all just another family outing of the past. The bad weather seemed to have shut the promised birds up, though, and he felt briefly cheated. Couldn't they tell they should have the sense to sing their hearts out? Songlan was pawing at Xiao Xingjin's hand again, and he darkly concluded the man might need to learn what losing an arm or two felt like soon. "Yes, please, they said it should be nearby," Xiao Xingjin softly answered. He bit down on his tongue to keep from asking, "What? What is?" Then bit even harder to keep from crying out when Songlan walked over and grabbed the ropes, lifting him back on his feet like a piece of cumbersome baggage. Funeral decorations were so common in the city, he didn't even reflect on the pieces of paper money drifting by on the rising wind until they reached a fresh grave, a few stumps of incense still smoking, and something clicked. Ah! Xiao Xingjin approached the mound of dirt, then stopped, bowing deeply, and Xu Yang didn't need to see his face to know he was weeping bloody tears again. The wind carried the sound of his voice away, and either way the words were too softly spoken to make out, but he could guess at them. "I'm sorry," and "You were right," and other pointless things, no doubt. He glared at the grave. She hadn't had to die. Another thing not part of the plan. Stupid, stupid little blind, crashing into all those carefully laid plants and toppling them all over. Such a frail little broken thing, yet she had struck back when it mattered, cost him everything. Almost everything, he reminded himself with a starved look at Xiao Xingjin. Clever and fearless at the end. If she hadn't been so annoying, he could have respected that. He solemnly concluded that if his hand hadn't been tied behind his back, he would have graciously left a piece of candy for an offering. One of her few saving graces, appreciating at least some of life's good things, like himself. Sweet things, he thought, glancing back at the white-clad figure with an odd smile. We both liked sweet things. In the end, she should have known he wasn't one to share. Xiao Xingjin lingered at the grave for a long time, even after running out of things to say, just stood there, head bowed, and the wind tugged at his clothes and hair. The sharp-toothed creature of concern started gnawing at Xu Yang's guts again, soul barely held together, and so newly bound back in mortal flesh, it couldn't be good for him to spend so much time in death's company. "We should go," he muttered, and would not admit it had been meant mostly for Songlan to hear. All his many, many faults aside, at least the idiot could be counted on to want to protect Xiao Xingjin. He was studiously ignored and curled his lips in frustration. He shouldn't spend so long here, he tried again, actually turning to the man this time, absolutely ready to kick at him if he kept ignoring him. That did earn him a look. The one that managed to be utterly empty, yet filled with distaste at the same time. "He's mourning," Fu Shui poured onto the ground, and he tilted his head back, rolled his eyes. "I know that, so tell him to mourn faster. This isn't a good place for him to be." Songlan half turned to him, and the disgust was winning out, crinkled those stone-faced features into something almost like a human expression. "You really couldn't care less." He grinned. It was a petty triumph that the man deigned to poke at the dirt just to make conversation, but he'd take any triumph he could get, and he had never ever claimed to not be petty. "Care? Why on earth should I care? Once dead, a body's just meat. Bury it, burn it, dump it in a ditch, doesn't make them more or less dead. Fresh ones make for good spare parts, though." He unleashed his best laugh, eager to ignite the look in Songlan's eyes even further. And then half his face exploded into pain, 1,000 tiny cuts, the attack so unexpected it sent him staggering back, almost falling over, unable to balance himself. His head jerked up, eyes shocked wide. Songlan was looking at him with that look of purest distaste, the horsetail whisk still half raised in his hand. He blinked, one eye already swelling and tearing up, and then he roared and threw himself at the Dao Shi, bound arm be damned, to rip out his throat with his teeth. He never stood a chance, of course. Between one heartbeat and the next he was face down in the dirt, gravel against his teeth, with Song Lan's hand clenched in his hair and a knee firmly planted in the small of his back. He snarled again, kicking and trying to bite at the hand holding him down, to no avail. Fu Shui clattering to the ground, Song Lan's other hand grabbed at the ropes to hold him down more firmly, and the knots twisted and tugged at his bad hand until he shrieked with it, just barely managing to make it into curses instead of sobs. In a blur he made out something entering his field of vision, white, boots first, then roped knees hitting the ground. "You won't even let me grieve?" Xiao Xingjin breathed, voice as hollow as the wind, and he froze, swallowing his tongue not to make another sound. Song Lan stiffened too, letting go, reaching out to grab at both of Xiao Xingjin's arms as though to keep him from falling in on himself. Blood dripped into the dust and his head jerked up. He saw the bandages were soaked through, dyed all red, streams of blood running down the ashen cheeks. He could feel his heart stopping, a lightning strike of utter panic hitting every nerve at once. Xiao Xingjin seemed almost translucent, looking as soulless as he had all those years in the casket, face unmoving. "No, no, 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 no. Xiao Xingjin!" It came out barely a croak. Song Lan furiously kicked him aside, supposedly to shut him up, but he barely felt it. "We have to leave, have to get him away from here. He has to rest. Hold him, do something. Can't lose him again. No, 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 please." He could all but see the spellwork unraveling, ripped too thin from the onslaught of emotions, tearing at the seams. "Hold him!" he yelled again, struggling up on his knees as Song Lan snapped out of his shock and wrapped his arms around the shaking man, grounding him in the world of the living. "You can't let go, Xiao Xingjin. You have to live. You have to. You still have reason to, don't you? Don't you want to live for him? Isn't that what you came back for? Isn't he your missing piece? Wasn't he the piece missing all along?" The words were tumbling out, each and every one destroying him to speak out loud, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered. Only one thing. Only one desperate thing. The wind sighed in the trees, a moment of silence before Xiao Xingjin went soft in his companion's arms, resting his forehead on his shoulder again like the day before. "I'm so tired," he whispered. Song Lan held him, so gently for a fierce corpse, then stood, pulling Xiao Xingjin along with him to his feet, still cradled tight against him. With a flick of his wrist, Fu Shui returned to his hand, and the dry tablet of blood-spattered road cracked into characters. "Song Daozhang says... he says he's got you," Xu Yang managed, voice raspy. "We'll go a little farther, then rest." Xiao Xingjin remained silent for a moment, then gave a small, exhausted nod. It took a few tries to climb to his feet, hurrying in choked silence after the perfect yin and yang that were the two Dao Shi leaning on each other. After only a few minutes of walking, the storm finally broke. And if he was grateful for the rain running down his cheeks, he would never admit it, even to himself.